In this video, we're going to talk about how to include the motion sensor in our nightlight. What we'd like to have happen is for motion to trigger and turn on the LED only when it is dark. So we're going to use both the motion sensor as well as the light sensor to make that happen. So we have a passive infrared motion sensor. Basically what this sensor is doing is detecting something that emits IR radiation, basically heat, that is moving from one side of the detector to another. You can learn more about how this works with the link in this presentation, but basically we have ways to connect to this sensor. We're going to supply a voltage to this pin over here. This is looking at the underside of the sensor. The ground is connected to the other pin on the other side, and in the middle of those two pins is where we're going to get the data output. That's where it's going to tell the Arduino that it's sensing motion. So the data output that this gives is a digital output, so it's either 1 or 0. So there are two different modes that you can set the trigger or the sensor to send its output, and those two different modes are chosen by how this jumper is placed on the bottom of the sensor. There's a little yellow jumper that you can either place between the upper two leads or the lower two leads. In the high position, or the H position, it is a repeat trigger. That means that once it triggers, it's going to continue to send that trigger. If it's in the lower position, it's a single trigger. It seems to work better if it's a repeat trigger, so that's where we're going to make sure that the little yellow jumper is in that position. So we can also change the sensitivity as well as the time delay adjustment. Let's see how things work with them as they are, and if those need to be adjusted, we can work on that. So a basic schematic of how we're going to connect this sensor. The output pin is going to get connected to the digital I/O pin D3 on our Arduino Uno or Arduino Nano. We'll connect the plus pin to 5 volts and the minus pin to ground. You can see a little bit of a picture here. This is a little more detailed schematic. VCC is the supply voltage. Out is the output of the sensor, and ground, G and D, is ground. So like I said, we will be connecting the VCC to the 5 volt pin on the Arduino. We'll connect output to digital pin 3 on the Arduino, and ground will be connected all the way over here, jumping over this connection to the ground pin on the Arduino. So taking a look at kind of a drawing of how that would look, I'm using the rails here. So the plus rail is a supply voltage. We can see I've got the 5 volts connected to the supply voltage. We're using that for both the voltage divider on our light sensor circuit, and we'll also use it to supply for our PIR sensor, our motion sensor. We're going to use the negative rail as the ground rail, so we have that connected from the Arduino to this rail, and anything connected to that is ground. We're using that rail for ground for 3 things: for the ground for our voltage divider circuit, the ground for our common cathode pin for our LED, and then we'll also use it for the ground for the sensor. And here we have the output of the sensor connected all the way over to D3, digital pin 3. So let's take a look and see how we would hook this up on the actual device. So now that we have the motion sensor connected to the Arduino, it's time to add the code to our our already programmed light sensor triggered LED so that it will incorporate the motion sensor. So we have the program as it's already set up from the last video, and underneath this is dark value. We're going to set up a constant for our motion sensor pin. So we need to be able to tell the Arduino which motion sensor or which pin we're going to connect the motion sensor to, or at least define its name. So just like before definition, we're going to name this one motion sensor, and it's going to be connected to digital pin 3. Make sure that that's how your setup is done so that the code matches the Arduino connections. In addition to defining where that sensor is connected, where we'll get the output from the sensor, we need to have a variable initialized for storing the value that the motion sensor is going to give us. So this is going to be an integer, and we want to say, we're going to call this variable isMotion. We'll initialize it as 0. This is going to be a digital value. So if this output from the sensor is going to be 1 when it senses motion, and it's going to be 0 when it does not sense motion. So we'll be updating this variable as the program senses, or the Arduino senses motion. In addition, so in the setup function, we have our red, green, and blue pins for the LED defined as output. Those modes are outputs. That means that the Arduino is going to send information or signal to that. We need to set up we need to initialize the digital pin 3 as an input. So we will do another pin mode statement, and we'll use that name that we just created, and we'll set that to input. And we've already got our serial port opened, and now we're going to, rather than reading the value for the light sensor, we would like to see, so that we can test and make sure that the motion sensor is sensing motion. We're going to change this and say get the value for what the motion sensor is saying. We'll use a digital read statement, and we're going to read from the motion sensor. And this is reading the motion sensor output or input. Okay, so we're now ready to collect that variable. We need to be able to print it out. So we'll just change the serial print statement so that it's printing the isMotion variable. So now at this point, we should be able to upload this code to our Arduino, and we should be able to sense whether or not there's motion. So click the upload button and upload it to your Arduino. Uh-oh, that means I spelled something wrong. Ah, here's the spelling error. There. So now try again, upload the code. So in order to test to see if our code is working like we expect, we need to open that serial monitor again. So we open it and we start to see the data coming in for the sensor. It's all zeros because it's not sensing motion. And when there's no motion, we'll have a 0 value. I can move my hand in front of the sensor and it starts to see a 1. It sends the 1 that it's sensing motion. Okay, so that is working. And we can move on with the rest of our code. So now that we know that we can read from our motion sensor, we need to add the logic so that we can only turn the LED on when motion is being sensed and when it's dark. So we already have our logic for if it senses a darkness that it turns on the LED. We're going to use a nested if statement in order to create this effect that we would like. So we already have an if value. If it's dark, turn on the light. We want it to be if it's dark and if the motion is sensed. So that means that we're going to put another if loop inside this, this light if loop. So I'm going to say if is motion, and we'll do 2 equal signs to say if, check and see if it is equal to high. And the high value is a 1, so I could put a 1 here, but I'm going to put high so that we think about, you know, on and off, high and low. So if motion is high, that means it's reading a motion from the motion sensor. Then we want it to do some stuff, and we want it to turn on the LED. So I'm actually going to tab these over so that it's, if the motion's high, do what's inside these brackets. So I need to add another bracket after this and close that bracket. So now we have a little square around there. We can see that this bracket matches with this bracket. So that is a little bit of a help. So it's going to say if there's darkness, that's what this is doing. And if there is motion, then we're going to turn on the LED. And now we need to tell it what to do in any other condition. So we need to say else, and I want it to turn everything off. So we have to, whoops, when we do an else statement, we've got to open the curly brackets, and we'll close the curly brackets. It gave me one there automatically, which is nice. So I'm going to say we'll turn off the LED. So this means that if it is dark but there's no motion, then we want the LED to be off. And this else statement says if the light value is not less than the dark value, so it's not dark, then we will turn on the or turn off the LED. And we have a delay statement here. That's just so that we can have data transmitting and give it a little bit of time to kind of catch up in between the loops in the computing. But one extra thing that we would like to do, so rather than it flashing on and off when there's motion, we would like to have it delay for a little while, because, you know, a motion sensor or a motion triggered night light will stay on for a little bit of time while you're up and doing whatever. So you would like to have it stay on for a little while. So we're going to actually add a delay statement here so that it just pauses for a little while, and I'm going to make it 3 seconds. You can choose what amount of time you'd like to keep it on for. So that the LED stays on for a little while after it senses motion. And basically that is all for the code. it's time to upload it and test it. So we'll upload this to our Arduino and go ahead and test. Okay, so I've uploaded my code and now I'm going to test to make sure it works. So we'll test two conditions. First, it's light and there's no motion, so it should be off and the LED is off. Well, it's actually three conditions we need to test. Then we'll test while it's light and there is motion, so I'll move my hand and the LED should not turn on, which it doesn't, so that's good. And now we should darken, and I'll do that by covering the sensor here, and it sensed my motion as I was covering it, but no motion and it's darkness and it's off. And then now if I move, it should turn on and stay on for 3 seconds, which it does. So all three conditions are satisfied. Motion and darkness, it turns on. No motion and darkness, it's off. Light and no motion, it's off. Light and motion, it's off. So we have a complete project.